All right, so I'm joined today by Henning, and actually, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, so I figured I'd
It's
ask you here. Is
perfectly
it
fine. Yeah.
Koch or Koch or something else?
It's Koch. It's like the
Koch.
cook in
Okay,
German.
excellent. Okay. All right, so yes, I'm joined by Henning Koch, and basically, you are the creator of Unpoly.js, and
Yeah.
yeah, so I wanted to check in. This is sort of people may be familiar with it as a JavaScript. Do you consider it a framework or a library? Just off the uh, you know
I think it's a framework because we call your code, you don't call us, but it
because
plays
we
very
call your
nice
code, you don't
with
call
with
us.
your own. If you have another external dependency or something, it's not possessive about the DOM or something, so you can make changes to the DOM without unpoly blowing up. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
And so it's kind of a one of the sort of hypermedia approaches.
yeah.
I think of it as sort of similar to HTMX in the world of JavaScript kind of frameworks and libraries and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess my first sort of thing is just kind of like you're calling from Germany right now, or
Yes,
where are you
I'm
calling from?
in Augsburg. This is in Bavaria, Germany, so in the southern part near the
Okay,
Alps. Yeah.
nice. So how did you kind of like, I guess just some quick background on like what's your sort of programming, how'd you get into it? How long have you been working on stuff?
Okay, so I've been doing web development work since I think the late 90s or something. So I started basically with CCI scripts and Perl and eventually discovered Ruby in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Um, and this is something that I've been doing since. So Ruby is like my first love as
Okay.
far as languages go. And this is also what I do in my day job. So I'm heading development at Macandra. We are a Rails consultancy in Germany. So we're doing a lot of bespoke web applications built on Ruby and Rails. But of
Yeah.
course, we also have like a big front end part, like every ambitious application has these days. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know, Rails has kind of their own, and I work in Laravel in general and PHP in Laravel, and they have their own
But that's
sort of,
nice. Yeah.
Livewire is sort of their version of a, non-React hypermedia style. Livewire is a little different than I would say Unpoly and HTMX. It's a little more integrated with the backend with the
Yeah.
PHP. But I know Rails kind of has their own thing too. So did you sort of, I guess where did Unpoly come from? Did it sort of, is this something that you came up with and sort of have sort of been building over the years, or is it sort of like there was other stuff out there and you
Mhm.
wanted
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
your own version?
Okay, so it's a pretty mature framework. I started building this like 10 years ago. I think tomorrow is 10 years ago.
Oh,
Looked up the
nice.
first commit, and
That's cool.
back in that time there wasn't like a very good frontend story for Rails. They have this Hotwire Turbo thing now, but that's only like 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah.
Back then we had turbo links in Rails, which was like a very basic way to do in-page navigations, but
Yeah,
nothing
I
fancy.
I
You only
remember it.
swap like the whole body. And
Yep.
I think this was my main motivation. And I'm like, if there's any origin library, that would be Turbo Links.
So TurboLinks existed, but it was kind of, so I was programming around then in the same time period, and I remember we had
Okay.
PJAX was another one that was kind
Yeah.
of like I tried out, and but the desire was to, you know, basically not have to do a full page reload every time somebody clicked. That was kind of my and I started getting into some of the front end frameworks and experimenting with Angular and stuff like that. But I do remember sort of wanting to have a solution to, like, you don't want to necessarily rewrite your whole app, but you do want to load tabs by fragments and stuff like that. So was this kind of like so you just started building your own, like, for your own projects kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, this was also the time where we tried to find a better way to do front-end, and we also went all in on Angular for a while, but then like Angular 1 went end of life, and you basically had to rewrite everything for Angular 2. And that was like the point where we did like this big retrospective, and like it took a good look, an honest look, if we're really happy with what we built. And because we always thought once we get into these heavy SPA frameworks, like everything would be structured and easy, but it wasn't like that. Like it was like a lot of code, a lot of dependencies, like complicated control flow, and that was the point where we like revisited the idea of rendering on the server again. But we didn't want to do this like bespoke at every project anymore, because I mean every project has this old jQuery snippet at the time where you like fetch some URL, and then when you get the response you like replace some fragment on the page. But I mean there are like a million edge cases you don't cover with that, and also a lot of use cases you could do if you invested a little more time into doing this properly and having some structure and standards around this. And that was when we came up with Unpoly and the idea of expanding on this concept of only updating fragments. And we realized that a lot of pain that we had with these original server-side MPAs, where everything is a slideshow, just went away by replacing fragments, like losing scroll positions or losing like some transient state on the page, like an unsafe form or something. That like most of that goes away entirely. And like when we saw that the sweet spot was neither like a full MPA and neither like a full SPA, it was like something in the middle, and that's Unpoly for us. And we expanded on that since then a lot. So I didn't think I would be working on this 10 years later when I started it.
I mean, it's a so, you know, part of what I'm just kind of like interested in, it's a bold move to make your own framework, you know, when you're going into this stuff. I mean, I guess if the alternative is just kind of like creating a new solution for every project, then it seems like, oh, okay, better to make an internal framework. But it's still kind of like, you know, so you're working with clients, presumably, from a bunch of different companies, or, you know, is it like, what was the kind of like decision process there? Like, could you make the call, or were you in the position to make the call, or you pitched it to a team or something like that?
Okay, so I could have made the call, but like from my experience, it's not a good idea to like prescribe something top down to your team, because if they don't end up accepting it, just be like
you get
bad morale and like everyone. So basically, I started playing with this with some internal projects in my spare time, and then just started to integrate this with a few client projects I did at that time, and then I saw it being organically adopted like in the company. Like I didn't push it too much. And basically it organically came to a point where we now would do most of our applications with that stack. So it's raised in the backend, and it's a pretty vanilla JavaScript front end with Unpoly and a few dependencies for stuff like, I don't know, multi-select, date pickers, and so on. I mean, we do have some React in some apps. Like, for instance, if we have like a pretty ambitious component that does a lot of like heavy optimistic rendering or something, then that's still something that where like the React approach, the client-side approach, profits a lot from. But even in that scenario, we mostly run this in a rectangle on the page, and the routing around this is just a multi-page app with Unpoly.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can get into some of the specifics of what Unpoly is. So I took a look. I haven't used it in a big project. You know, I've been using HTMX for a lot of stuff, and I think my experience is sort of similar, where I was like, you know, okay, I'll try this out, and like, you know, and just kind of it's such a revelation in some ways for me to build an app like this, where you're mainly just building it in like the most obvious, clear way, and then just kind of like adding in, you know, in your case, Unpoly, but adding in these kind of hypermedia calls and like fragments and stuff like that. And it's like, so, you know, I definitely can see the appeal of where you're sort of, it starts to take, now I basically do every project with, some version of this, because it just has made my life a lot easier when you're working on a lot of different projects.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not the best, like, I'm not a HTMX pro or something, because we have our own thing. So of course I'm aware of HTMX, and I know Carson a little, and I think everyone knows at least his marketing.
Right.
But yeah, I think there are some parallels, even though this is like a parallel evolution. So in both worlds, we keep the servers producing the HTML, and we keep most of the logic on the server, where we can have like immediate access to our data, where we can choose our language and so on. I think like there are a few differences, if that's like a good way to explain it. In Unpoly, the default is that like every HTML endpoint always renders a full page. And I believe this is like something that you can do in HTMX, but it's not the default. I think a lot of HTMX developers only render fragments. And the reason is that like we have like a big focus on progressive enhancement, meaning that you build a multi-page app without any client logic first, and then you enhance it by like sprinkling like custom attributes over your views. So those attributes look a little like HTMX attributes. It's just that they have a different prefix. I think in HTMX it's like HX, and for us it's UP, so it's like up target or up follow or up submit. But it looks similar. And so the one thing that we get from that is like every endpoint is always something that works like directly without JavaScript and can always do a full page load. And since we like what we wouldn't do in Unpoly is like this HTMX thing of every element can do everything. So this is not something that we do. So for instance, everything that's a link is still a link, or everything that's a form is still a form, which like has some benefits like being able to work without JavaScript, or like having a better default accessibility story. I mean, you can do everything you can do in Unpoly, you can do in HTMX also, but I think it's like it's more like it gives you the low level tools and leaves it up to you to compose it. Whereas Unpoly is like very heavy on defaults, and it tries to be like smarter by default. I think that's like a pretty fundamental difference in philosophy also.
I think that sounds right to me. Just kind of that general thing of the HTMX feels a little more low level, and just sort of one of the first examples. So on the Unpoly page was kind of just being able to pop up a dialogue, which like is not part of HTML. If you want to sort of do that in HTMX, you can obviously figure out how to how to do dialogues, but that's not built in any way, any sort of kind of interaction with that sort of stuff. And so just trying one of those examples out, like that was the first difference I noticed, was like the idea that you have like a link and you want to open it in a dialogue. So you click it, I checked, okay, we have this, you added this attribute of, up layer. So this is concept of layers, which I think is really interesting, which you express through dialogues. So it's like a built-in browser thing. So, as far as I know, there's like complete support for it. But you, from your front end, you say like you have a layer, and wherever this link is, I want it to pop up on a new layer. And so then it kind of overlays it, puts it into that dialogue, and, shows you on that next layer. And then if you refresh, so it's actually also changing the, it's actually going to that link up in the URL bar. So, let's say you're looking at the details of a project, it's going to that link, and you now have, that project opened in a dialogue. If you refresh, so this is what was unusual to me. I was like, well, what's going to happen when I refresh? Because, coming from HTMX and sort of some of the other ones, my first thought is that it just loaded a snippet, a fragment of HTML. And when I refresh, it's going to have some way to handle it. But what it does is it just loads whatever went into that dialog in the full screen, because like you said, everything is an HTML page, right?
Yeah, I mean you can configure whether you want like a layer to have its own URL or not. So we usually do it if the content that's shown in the dialog is actually a full page that can work on its own. Coming back to your like basic CRUD example, basically, for instance, we have like a model called projects, and it has like a name as attribute, and then we start building like a basic MPA which cannot have dialogues basically. So you have like an index of all your projects, and then you have a button called new project, and then that just switches to a new screen. So you start with that. And what you can do with like this up layer attribute you mentioned is you say that this new project button that you have anyway opens in a dialog. And like since it would also work like in a full page, you can choose to update the URL with the location. But what Unpoly does then after this is, since it's fully aware of layers and what goes in with layers, it can isolate all the interactions into the layers. So for instance, if the new project form is a multi-step interaction, or if that new project form has validations that would require a user to submit the form multiple times, it will always be contained in that overlay until you explicitly say, I want to close it. And you can even do stuff like with the link that opens the new project form, you can say, how long you want to keep that overlay form open. For instance, you say, the new project form is done when you have reached like any show page of a project, because then you have completed the creation process. Or you can wait for some events to be emitted on the overlay element. So then we can even do it in a way that the project form does not need to know whether it's currently being displayed in an overlay or in a full page. So like this is like some of the benefits we get when the framework actually knows that this interaction opens a new overlay, as opposed to we're rendering a fragment that happens to draw a box that is styled like an overlay.
It doesn't know anything else. If you just are doing a fragment, you're expecting something else to know all the details of what the context is and everything like that. So I thought this like concept of layers, just kind of looking over it, was really interesting. I haven't really thought of web development in that way. I will say, like I've been working on mobile programming to some degree with Flutter and just in general on mobile. They have something called context, and you could sort of think of it as the layer. It's like it stacks these contexts on top of each other, and so each page knows which context it's in. So if you hit the back button, it knows, okay, now we're leaving this context, we're going to the previous one, we're popping. And I just haven't really seen this much in sort of web development context.
Maybe we have like something like context. So these overlays, they have a mode, that meaning like how do they look and feel? Like the default mode is just in a modal dialog, but then there's a mode for like a drawer that flips in from this that moves in from the side, and we also have a mode called cover, which just like covers the entire screen. And maybe that's something like your context, because for instance, if you have a mobile, you have a settings menu where you can make a few configurations for your account, then return to the original interaction. You can probably just like move in a cover overlay, do your state changes, and then like return to the original interaction without the configuration screens knowing about the previous interactions, because it's just stacked on top of the original interaction, and it never actually left the page.
So is this like, I will say, well, one of the examples that I tried, one of the first examples I tried was to do that pop-up. And at first it didn't work. I had a link, I gave it up layer equals new, and nothing happened when I clicked it. So I was trying to figure out, okay, like what am I missing here? And you have to add somewhere in your DOM up main, right, for that to work. So is that what gives it its sort of layer context? Like each layer has an up main. Is that sort of an accurate thing, or is that sort of what
So whenever you update a fragment or open overlay, Unpoly needs to know which fragment to extract from the response and which fragments around it to discard, because we only use fragments. So if you can just give a CSS selector to target, you can do up layer main and then up target, I don't know, hash my fragment. If you don't have a target, it just will try to find the dominant content area on your page, and in HTML5 that's like a main element. You can use a main element, or you can use like an app main attribute that you mentioned if you don't want to use a main element.
Okay, so main, so actually you have like a tag main on your page a lot of times.
You can use a tag main, or you can use the app main attribute on any element of your choice. And that's like the thing that Unpoly falls back when you don't give an up target.
Yep. So one of those has to be on the page for it to sort of have any idea of what the context is. And then if you open a layer, is it using the new layers up main to kind of like say like, okay, this is now my root within this layer, so that if you then open, for instance, a second layer on top of that, like does it sort of I guess like how is it keeping track of layers? Like if you are kind of trying to like, does it think of each layer as a full HTML page?
It's like every layer has a root element. We cannot have multiple like HTML documents on the page, because like this stuff on the top with the head and the HTML that can only be there once. But
right.
You will usually have like one layout container or something, some layout container element, or like a main element. You can also like do different root elements for the root page and the overlay. For instance, the overlay, sometimes you want to exclude a navigation bar.
Yeah, that's a good example.
But basically, if you, in your example, if I were to stack like 10 layers on top of each other for some reason, each of these layers would like have their own root main element. And when you make any interaction within a layer, like for example, follow a link or submit a form, then it will again find the main element in that response and replace the main element with a fresh one from the server.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because most of the time these layers, you're just going to use them to pop up a dialog and do some work and save it and close and stuff like that. But it's something I haven't really seen before, so I just think it's kind of an interesting thread to pull, where it's like, well, okay, so if you're thinking of the web as these layers, like what does that mean for you? So yeah, no, I think that's interesting. So let me see here. Let me something. When you're sort of targeting stuff, do you have a concept? So, like you said, you can kind of like ignore navigation. Because you're returning every page as a full HTML, how do you kind of decide, like, what's the syntax for deciding, okay, when so I'll just say in HTMX, you have this concept of HX select. So if you do pull a whole HTML page back from the server, but you just want to take out one, you do HX select equals, you give it a CSS selector, and then it takes that fragment out and puts it into your target. So what's the version of that for sort of the default Unpoly?
So like for instance, if you follow a link, you would have an attribute up target that also contains a CSS selector, and that selector is expected to be present in both the current page and the service response. Like for instance, if you had up target hash fragment, then an element with the ID fragment would be selected in the current page, and then would be selected in the response. And then those two would be swapped.
Gotcha. So it's matching CSS selectors.
Yeah.
Does that sort of, okay. Because so that was one of the first things, like kind of like shifting mindset, was you have an example on your homepage of two cards, right? Like they're flipped, you see the back of the card and you can click to flip it, right? So, kind of just the basic concept of this. And so I did like an inspect element to see, okay, what's happening here when you flip this card. And it's pretty interesting because it's like you have so you have two separate cards, but you have a single HTML page for the front of both cards and a single HTML page for the back of both cards. And yet, when you click one of the cards, it's returning that card only flipped, and the other card is not flipped. So that's kind of, that's just, I was trying to wrap my mind. I feel like that's probably a core thing about Unpoly, is wrapping your mind around that idea that somehow you were able to, when you clicked it, you told it to, fetch the back HTML, but only swap out the part of HTML of whatever I clicked on. Does that sound sort of what's happening there?
Yeah, in that example, the one, so both cards are like vanilla hyperlinks. It's just an A element, an A anchor element, and one of the cards has an up target of .1, and the second card has an up target of .2. And the first card also has the class 1, and the second one has the class 2. So if I click on the second card with the class 2, it also has the up target class 2. So it finds the new version of the respective element in the response, and that's why you only see one of those two cards flipped.
Finds the new version of it. Okay, so because it knows that it came from the click of 1. Let me see here.
Because the link you interacted with had an up target equals .1, and that's the selector we look for in both the current page and in the response.
Gotcha. So yeah, it's just, it's just an interesting way to kind of think about it. So like in general, you're building these pages, and you might have like two HTML pages that are somewhat similar, but you're keeping in mind that you have these, selectors, and you keep those selectors the same so that you can then kind of do clever stuff with them, like not load the navigation, because the navigation's gonna match, stuff like that.
Yeah. And you can also like compose pages like in interesting ways. Like for instance, let's say you have like a list of projects, again with the example from earlier, and like you have for each project you have your own URL that shows details about the project. And now in a multi-page app, you would just have like a list of projects, and then it links to the detail page of project 1. The next link links to the detail page of project 2. So now, without like changing anything about the backend, you could say, let's do this in a way that we show these detail pages inline in the index. Whenever I click on project 2, it would just like expand that row in the table to show the entire project within that list. So that's like a screen that doesn't really exist in the MPA backend.
Yeah.
But I can just by choosing my up target attribute, I can compose them in the different page. Or again, with the layer example earlier, I can choose to open that detail page in an overlay. So I can keep, like in the backend, I can keep this context of the list with the scroll position. I'm on page 3 and have scrolled down, 300 pixels, and I can just like keep that and like open that in an overlay. And like that's like a nice way to have, on the one side, we have like an MPA backend that fully works without JavaScript if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But we can like compose it in different ways. So we don't have this jarring effect of every link blows up the entire page and you lose all your navigation state and your scroll positions and so on.
Right. So in the case of like you have a long list and you need to get the details, you would have kind of like an empty placeholder div or something like below each item, and then you set that as the target. Would that be kind of?
You could have an empty placeholder, or you replace like with the list item element itself, like one of those two. I would think.
Okay, yeah. Replace the list item itself with the detailed version, and then if you were to. So that at that point, you can decide, do I want to set this project to my URL, or do I want to, just have it not set there? Because then if you set it to the URL, then you refresh, it's like you're going to get whichever last one you expanded, which might not be what you want.
I mean, again, you can decide it, but with everything, we have like a very strong opinionated default. like in this case, the default would be whenever we update a main element, then it's also by default a new history entry, because like this is like a substantial piece of content that you're switching to. You're probably like replacing the dominant content area, so that is usually a good idea to have its own URL. But if you were like only in the example with the card, like only flipping one card, but you're still like on this deck of cards type of screen, then I wouldn't flip to the URL of like an individual card or to the backside of the card. So that doesn't make sense. Like, yeah.
Right. Okay. And do you set a default for that, or like is it so like I don't remember seeing a default in the card example. So like what would have happened if I refreshed, or let me see here. So I think maybe the card example doesn't change the URL. Let me see.
I think not, because it's not updating a main element. It's just updating an element with a custom selector .1 or .2. So we like keep the history as it is. You can always override the defaults, but this is like we have, and this is probably something that I like got from my time in Railsland is like to have like very strong defaults for everything, convention over configuration and so on, which I know a lot of people don't like at all. They just want to have everything explicit, and they like don't want to have any magic ever. But that's also maybe a different philosophy here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would think of it as like, you have 10 plus, maybe 20 years, experience building web apps. So it's like when you sit down to make a web app, like you probably have a pretty good idea of what defaults you want to use. And they probably make sense, particularly for, your sort of use case. And I guess like in general, what sort of apps are you building? Like, what's the sort of like, is it, you said it's an agency that you're part of, but like, what's the kind of like, is it all over, or is it certain types of apps?
Since we do bespoke web apps, it's not one type, because if it's like a basic CMS, people would just use WordPress and be done. So people go with other ones. They say, for instance, they need a custom CMS or like a custom ERP system. They need to have some process automation interface or have some digital product. So it's like all over the place, all industries, like all types of apps. Sometimes it's like a very ambitious front end, which is visible to the public. Sometimes it's just like an internal, millions of backend screens, where there's not so much focus on design and more about like features for power users and like a small closed circle of users. I think something that like I think Unpoly lends itself in particular to those backend interfaces. I mean, it can do like heavy front-end stuff as well, but I think stuff like I told earlier with the layers and so on, this is something that you can do if you have some control over the UI. If you do a fully bespokely designed front end, sometimes you like you need to customize everything, and then you cannot like use so much of the default that we have for you.
Well, I mean, I did see like you've Unpoly, or you've put some work into transitions and sort of some front end goodness. So is it where do you sort of see Unpoly in terms of like the front end UI experience? Like, do you have kind of like fun with that, like building that stuff out, or is it sort of like, like, do you feel like you're moving closer to where you will sometimes use React? Is that sort of the goal, is to push Unpoly, like to make it smoother, or is it, what do you sort of see for yourself on building those transitions and other front end
so
stuff?
like since I have like one foot in both the Unpoly world and also a little in the React world, I feel like both approaches like have to deal with this network gap. So, and they have to deal it in different ways. So for instance, when you have a React component, like it's always a pain to not have synchronous access to your data. So you have to like fetch stuff and think about what's happening, what's going to happen if the user interacts before you have the data and so on. You have to bridge that gap somehow. And with the Hypermedia approach, you have things that the front end doesn't know about, and you need to somehow wait for the server. And I feel like both approaches have been like flirting with techniques from the other side. So in React, you have stuff like a server component where you say, okay, it's just too much of a pain, or it's too slow to run stuff on the client. So we like have to move that part to the server again. And in the Hypermedia world, you have stuff like HTMX or Unpoly that also like tries to push the boundaries, how responsive and how snappy your interface can be, without actually like having the template to render a new state. So in the new 3.10 release I'm working on right now, we have stuff like arbitrary loading states where you can like make arbitrary changes to this page while requests are loading, and you can even do stuff like optimistic rendering with it. With like there's a little duplication left, but there are cases where you can actually update the page without waiting for the server. And I think that's again one case where we try to use like the techniques from the dark side or something from the other side, because we all need to deal with that network gap. It just doesn't go away, and so I think that's like one reason why there's no longer like the one true way to build a web app, because it used to be that way, that there were this very sharp distinction between the multi-page and single-page approaches, but I see that like fading away more and more.
Yeah, I would agree, and it's, you know, I'm trying to like, sometimes I feel like I'm trying to get at the root of like what's the ideal here, where like, because obviously there's like there is this benefit in the React approach of you know, if your entire app is just like a local browser client side thing, then you know, I guess there's like sort of this you get immediate feedback on some things, right? But like that's just not the case in real, you know, I mean, in my opinion, I'll just like quickly throw out like why I kind of like have moved away from that. Like I think first of all, you're putting a lot on the browser. You're loading a lot that just doesn't need to be there, including information that you suspect they're going to need, or you need to be careful with, you know, how you sort of load information into the client if you're trying to keep a lot of it there. And then you're putting everything into memory. You have this huge virtual memory, like just pile, like, you know, there's the DOM, and then there's your virtual DOM, which has like hooks, and it has like just a whole bunch of event listeners. And my experience is that actually that's pretty slow. Like you're giving your browser a lot of work to do. And you're loading everything up front because it all has to be, your virtual DOM has to be built before you can really do anything. Whereas with HTML, you know, you can give it a little bit of HTML, and then just when you click, then you do something. So I'm obviously on the much more on the, you know, pro of the backend side, but it's like, I do understand there's certain things that, you know, and like you said, you sometimes reach for React. So when are those times? Like what's an example of one of these kind of like where you feel there's a component? There definitely are them. What's an example of one of those, you think?
Okay, so I have a good example here. So some time ago, we built like a helpline chat where like people could like get advice about STDs. So it's like a very sensitive topic.
Yeah.
And so the requirement was, first, it's a chat, so it needs to be real time, because you get an anonymous advisor, and you can chat with them in real time. Okay, that's like the first thing that doesn't. I mean, we can do it with polling or server-side events or something, but it's a pain. Okay. Then there was another requirement that since it's so sensitive, what's being discussed in that chat, it should be like end-to-end encrypted. The server should not know anything about the chat content. So, okay, one more argument.
Interesting. Okay.
And it's also something that we just didn't want that data on our server, like, because that's what like just in case that bad karma to have
well,
stuff like that
I'll
on
just say right
your
off the
database.
bat, if you're not keeping something on the server, it's I guess it does make sense to do a client-only solution.
So I think both the real-time thing, the expectations of the user to see messages immediately without waiting, like for the server to respond, the end-to-end thing, that was all things that play to the strength of React.
Yep.
But on the other hand, when you do like a React app that doesn't do optimistic rendering at all, that basically doesn't work offline at all, not even a little bit, where every meaningful interaction basically waits for a JSON endpoint.
Right.
Like, what are you doing? It's just, it's so much code. It's so much code for like no benefit. So I think just be honest and like play to the strength. If you're going to build a React app, build an app that uses React and does all these things like optimistic rendering and so on. And if you're doing an Hypermedia app, enjoy the fact that it's going to be like much less code. Enjoy the fact that it's probably going to have fewer dependencies, less complicated control flow, and so on.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's like, I think that's the big thing is like there's this kind of like, ultimately for most apps, what you just gave is an interesting example that's not like that. But most apps, like you're getting data from the server and like that's a good thing. That's like how it should be because your server is, presumably, safe and has an idea of what data it can give and what data it can't give. So you're going to have to go to the server. So it's like, I think this is like a fundamental misunderstanding of like, oh, well, like in React, you're still doing a JSON request. Like there's nothing faster about getting JSON than there is about getting HTML, I mean, I'm not sure exactly. Like, I guess I haven't, gotten the full sort of React version of that. Like, what's the case for React in those situations? And maybe there's just kind of like a front end, like when you click something, getting that immediate feedback. Maybe that's kind of the thing. But I think people who are, like you said, the gap has been bridged. There's all kinds of things now for that kind of immediate feedback and sort of letting you know that something's happening on the front end. Does Unpoly sort of handle that in you said like Unpoly basically kind of goes for as many defaults as possible. So like I'm just going to in my head picture it as like something similar to, an HTMX style or a turbo or what is it, Hotwire now. They changed some of their stuff around. But you have kind of curated the interactions and given, even though you can still access sort of the low-level stuff, you've curated it a little bit more and given some of the main defaults for stuff. Does that sound kind of
yeah,
right?
So like in the Rails world, there's this convention of a configuration thing, which means like if you tend to do the same thing in the same way all the time, that like don't do it, don't put it in the code. We will just choose it for you, and you just put it in the code if you want to do it to be different. Yeah. And so basically like for instance, we had this link that's going to be handled by Unpoly that's going to have an up follow attribute, but then there are like, I don't know, 50 other attributes that like modify the way the link is being followed. Like stuff like, are you going to animate the change? Where is the focus going to be when you update a fragment? What's going to happen with the scroll position, and so on and so forth. And all of these things have like a curated default, but you can override all the defaults. Like you can override at the link. You can also like configure the defaults globally. And if you're still not happy with this, we have like a very extensive JavaScript API. So everything, basically all the attributes that we have are just implemented in a way that, like, I don't know, on click, call this JavaScript function that we also expose to you. So if you're not happy with the way that we wire up things, you can always like build your own attributes. And we actually like have this registry where you can like add your own custom logic where you say like every time something with my custom attribute goes into the DOM, please activate this JavaScript on it. So you can like expand and build your own dialect of Unpoly if you want. But if you don't want it, we have like a very opinionated default how we think, how it works for us. That's a better way to say it. Yeah.
No, but that's nice. So you start off with like the minimal code in your opinion. For most of the time, you're just gonna want to add like a couple things, and then you do expose, if you need it, this kind of other layer of stuff. And so one thing I noticed that's right off the bat different from something like HTMX or maybe some of the other ones, it also includes a CSS file. So what's the CSS file? What kind of stuff does that kind of encapsulate?
So it's like it's very, very minimal. For instance, because we talked about the layers earlier, we need to have like some very basic styles to like open an overlay, and that's basically just a white box. Or I don't know, we have like an attribute to expand a link to a bigger surface. For instance, you have a link in the table and you want to make that the whole table row is clickable. Then we have an attribute for that, and that just changes the mouse over cursor to this hand pointer. So stuff like this. So we try to not be we try to not have opinions on the CSS side, because that's just too different across projects. There's like no common way to do CSS.
So it's not design stuff necessarily. It's more like browser UI expectations of like, functionality. Yeah.
It's maybe like 30 lines of CSS. That's very, very minimal.
Okay. Yeah. Nice. So what do you sort of think is, I think you mentioned it in you're working on 3.1 or 3.10 right now.
Yeah.
And what sort of, like big picture, what do you sort of see like for the framework? You said it's sort of moving, you're continuing to bridge that gap into front end world, and that's kind of the next phase or whatever.
So in 3.10, the main focus is offering some way to do optimistic rendering, like where you can do like temporary changes to the page while a request is loading, which is like reverted when the request ends for any reason. But I mean, looking further, I think something that I have like my eye on for like a breaking change is to try to use like web standards more, because we have like built a better form of many web APIs into the framework right now. But it's really hard, because like a lot of web standards leave so much to be desired, like stuff like, because we could talk so much about layers. I mean, of course, there's this dialog element, but it's like a mess. It's like a complete mess. How it looks, how it stacks.
By default, you can't even click off it and close it, right? Is that sort of
and then you go into the cross-browser inconsistencies and so on. And so we see a lot of stuff that's, in the last 10 years, I've seen a lot of stuff being added to the web platform that's kind of like things we have in the framework. And sometimes we can replace stuff from our userland code with web standards. For instance, like 10 years ago, we had this :has pseudo selector, which is like super useful, and we polyfilled that actually for up target attributes, because it's like so useful to refer to an element by the selector of its child. And
wait, sorry. So let me just. So the browsers added the has, you said, like that was like.
Did you know the :has?
Yeah, honestly, I've never used it in CSS. Yeah. I think that I've used it through Tailwind, because that's how you do the groups in Tailwind, right? Is that because like if you hover over a whole element, if you hover over a whole element, you want one particular CSS within that to change, or vice versa.
I don't know about Tailwind, but for example, let's say you have multiple groups of form elements on the page. I mean, with groups, I mean like this triple of you have an input and a label and maybe an error message. And those are always in a container like form group or something. But those containers, they don't have an ID I can target because it's always like the class form group.
Yeah.
So how are you going to target a form group that contains a particular input? Because the input does have a unique selector. It has a name, it maybe has an ID. So I can say I target a form group : has input name email. And then you target the container by the selector of its child.
Yeah,
so
okay.
That is something that we polyfilled like 10 years ago, but was actually became available over the last 2 years across all browsers. And now we can reuse that.
So you built your own at the time?
Yeah. We had like our own CSS selector engine.
Interesting.
But basically every single web framework, web platform feature like has like some significant drawback that you need to accept if you want to use it. So it's something like I'm trying on right now and see how it would feel, because what we would get is like we would have like maybe a little smaller file size of the library, but then again we would like could no longer cover a lot of edge cases that we do now. And
I can imagine that's tricky because the browsers, I've talked about that on here and kind of talked with Anthony Alaribe about it, but browsers are getting better and better, and so they do have more of this technology that's kind of built in. So it seems nice if you can leverage it, but if you are just using what they give you, that's also maybe not quite as powerful as being able to get in there and program your own in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I sometimes feel that the standards process is like inventing a lot of things from first principles instead of extracting it from what's out there, and they often end up like not giving developers what they need. So developers says, "Hey, I want X," and then there's a standards process, and that's okay. You want X, but here's Y because we think the Y is better than the X, and everyone still has no way to do templating in web components, but we have stuff like Shadow DOM style encapsulation that few people ask for, but
right.
That's a kind of frustration theory I have with using the platform sometimes. Yeah.
Right. Well, you're deep into it, like building your own versions of stuff. So it's like most people don't sort of see that from a farther out perspective where they just see the end result of it. But it's interesting to like actually be digging into it. One thing, so you mentioned, you're working on an optimistic UI possibility, just kind of having some support and stuff like that. So, how would that, so like, optimistic UI, I've thought of that as kind of like a tricky thing because you don't necessarily always want it. And I think the quote that I think maybe it was Carson, but it's like, there are the example, like, how optimistic do you really want it to be? Like, if the server, if you're assuming something's happening, and you tell the user that something has happened, that's very optimistic. But then you go to the server and there's something happen, your reservation doesn't go through. Like, you don't want to be too optimistic ahead of time, but you want to give them something. So like, what do you envision? And I just think of it when I think of a server side, like, the server has to be the ultimate thing that is the source of truth and that gives you the information that you want. So when you think of optimistic UI, do you think of like a placeholder that's like got a little spinner? Do you think of like, what the text might be? Like what's your vision or version of how that could work in Unpoly?
Okay. So it's not a vision because we're going to release all of this next week or something.
Next week, okay.
So
in some far distant future.
Maybe 3.10 will be out when this podcast is published.
Yeah, depending how long it takes me to download.
Okay, so I think first thing, you always want to signal that the app is working in some way. That can be something as trivial as a spinner or disabling the submit button or something. because I mean the default like loading indicator approaches, they're not great and they are not appearing in a single page interaction. So you need to do something. Like for instance, we have this like default progress bar at the top, and you probably want to have like some spinner image when you press a button or something. That's something that I would always do. But then I would use optimistic rendering in cases where I can expect the transaction to go through. For instance, like if you have a chat. Okay, when I'm writing you a message, I know that message is going to reach you, and that's also some expectations people have from using like their messenger apps on their phones and PCs. So why not immediately insert like the bubble with your message in the list that you already have? Like that's not so much work. Of course, you need a way to. So I think you need two things to make this ergonomic for the user, and I care a lot about like having like minimal APIs and having an ergonomic API. The one thing is you need to have some way to revert the change in case something unexpected does happen. Because like once every moon, the message doesn't go through because, for instance, you're offline or I don't know, you have deleted your account or something, and then we cannot leave this message bubble on the screen. So something that we do, we have a way to describe these temporary changes in a way that automatically get reverted when the request ends. So in the chat example again, I would like describe the insertion of the chat bubble. That's just like a one-liner. But Unpoly tracks the change to the DOM I did. And if the server responds anyway, it could be a successful response, an error response, or maybe no response at all, a timeout, then that gets reverted before it gets overwritten with the server response. In the success case, it would just be overwritten by an identical chat bubble, and I would not see any flash of content of state change at all. But in the case where the server responds to an error, my temporary message bubble would be removed automatically before the server shows, before the error message from the server is shown.
Yeah.
And I think sorry, do you want to?
Well, no, so I'm. Yeah. Well, okay, so I'm just like, I'm trying to picture writing that code. And, you know, one of the big difficulties is when you submit that chat, you have some text, right? Some text input. So are you defining a template, which is maybe the same on the server and the same on the client? Like, do you define like a div, or like, you know, let's say the chat box is like the Apple one, like it's like a green little, you know, so you have to make it look the same as what's going to come back from the server, but you have to make it empty so that, you know, it can be used in the same way, and new text each time you type a message in can be placed in there. So what's the kind of like, just logistically, like I'm just trying to imagine you define like an optimistic template that your data is going to go into with placeholders. Is that sort of what you're thinking, or how you worked it?
Okay, so in our version, that optimistic change is called the preview, and the preview has a name like add message. And in that add message preview, you would have access to the entire render path, including like any form data that is being submitted. So you already have the text. And then you need to like make an element that contains that text. I mean, if it's a trivial element, you can probably just like do a div and put the text, and that's that. But if it's like a more complicated component with a lot of HTML, that would be a lot of duplication, right? Because you already have the template on your server, and now you have it a second time on your client, and we don't want duplication, or we want to reduce it as much as possible. So in that case, you could, when you deliver the chat channel with all the messages, you could like render out a template, as you said. It could be like a template element that contains like the scaffold for a new chat bubble, like new message bubble. And in the preview, you can, instead of like passing in your HTML, you can also just refer to any template by a selector. And that's also like a very simple way to do stuff like placeholders, where you have like, I don't know, like this handlebar style, like, I don't know, curly brace, text, closing, curly brace,
slot of some
and
sort.
then put that in. Because that's like the second component that you need to reduce the duplication. You are going to have some level of duplication when you do optimistic rendering in a server-side approach. Because the client does not have access to the...
Right?
But I think there are ways to reduce it by, for instance, if you have a template, the server can render the template, and then it can maybe reuse some partial HTML that it has anyway, just with placeholder in it. I think the other way that we're going to use this is like to use optimistic rendering in those cases where either the duplication is low or where the extra efforts adds a significant value for the user. Like for instance, like if I have a high value screen where every conversion matters, and I know that snappy response times increase my conversions, maybe I can accept some duplication. But there are also cases where the duplication is naturally low. Like for instance, I guess you have like some form of calendar app, like Google Calendar or something, and then in the app you can drag like an event across days, right?
Yep.
So that drag and drop code is going to be on the client anyway, because if you need to do some like you need to have like 4 or 5 event handlers just for basic drag and drop.
Yeah.
So if you have already built the drag and drop code on the client, then you have this final event handler that registers the drop of an event into a new day. And at that point, you already have all the participating elements in your hand. You know which events being dragged. You know the target element is going to be dropped onto. And then it's just a one-liner to write the preview function that moves the event rectangle into the correct day while we're waiting for the server.
Interesting.
And
so
again,
case,
we have a way to describe that move across the DOM in a way that it can be reverted automatically in case the server responds with any unexpected content or even with expected content. So you don't have to deal with the reverting case. And I think that's a case where we can be opportunistic and just add this single line of code to make sure that we already render a state while we're actually waiting for the server to respond. And that, again, is a case where we don't usually have validations. There's no obstacle to moving an event into a new day. And so we aren't usually going to see an error from the server in that case. But even if you say, I want to convey that this is not a final change, there are like ways to like add a class to the event that says pending or something, and then you I don't know, like reduce the opacity so it's like you convey that this is a temporary change, and it will still feel more snappier than like just freezing the calendar until the server responds in 200 milliseconds or so.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think that totally makes sense. I was thinking of this sort of optimistic, where you usually are turning one version of something into another, like you're turning a form into an element that's then going to have a different style. But, the easier, like the more straightforward is you're moving one element to another place, and you're right. You have all the information you need to just drop that element into its new location temporarily, and then apply something to it if you want to. So that's sort of like that's like a Trello board. So, and you were talking about drag and drop. Is drag and drop? So the drag and drop is another thing that I see a lot as like, okay, we're gonna need a React style. We're gonna need an SPA style, to build a Trello board, to build a calendar thing, something like that. I know there's a drag and drop API on the web. Is that something that Unpoly that you guys have, that you've worked on at all in terms of that stuff to make that particular story you just described a little easier, or how does that sort of work in your mind?
So there's no so we don't wrap the drag and drop API from HTML.
Yeah.
We need to pick those. We need to choose the extraction that we see being implemented in the same way in multiple projects, and we haven't seen this in drag and drop so much.
Right.
But like the way you would build it in Unpoly is, so maybe you probably have some container that wraps, for instance, your month in a calendar app that's called, I don't know, .month, and then, or I don't know, .calendar or something. And you say, I want to register a new compiler, which is our way to activate JavaScript on existing elements that says, whenever an element with a class month goes into the DOM, run this JavaScript to initialize the default HTML drag and drop handlers on that element. And that's how I would approach this problem.
Yeah. No, and this would be just like a, add event listener type thing in JavaScript as a.
But I mean, there's so many edge cases, For instance, if you want to reorder stuff, it's important if you're like in the upper half of the element, because that's like a different drop position and so on. So that's something that I don't want to. I don't want to become a drag and drop library, because I already have
those
have too many
exist.
too many things I'm wrapping. Yeah.
But being able to do like what you just said with the optimistic, having a solution to being able to, at the end of the drag and drop, not just because what happens by default is like you finish your drag and drop and then it goes back to where you started from, and then you wait for the server and then it draws. So you get this weird, like, I dropped it, it's gone, where'd it go, what's happening, did I mess up, oh, it's back, now it's from the server, now it's live. So just having, some solution to that makes a huge difference, I think. So I think that's a nice, that's going to be a nice addition, I think, in general. Do you use any of the like view transition stuff that's kind of, I don't know if it's new in the browser? Like, is that something you've thought about? Because just the approach that Unpoly takes seems to be, matching up CSS selectors and kind of adding to the DOM, replacing from the DOM based on a lot of defaults, which, like, if you're giving it the same selector, it's pretty safe to say you want to be replacing that, which makes a lot of sense. And I think that's kind of also the directions that browser have been going with this view transition stuff. So even in an MPA now, theoretically, and I have not played with this myself much yet, because I guess I just don't care that much about transitions, but, if you have two separate pages and you assign view transition, if you put view transitions on, it will, and you click from one to the other, it will theoretically, if you have two things on one version of the MPA and have the same ID, it will transition from one to the next. For instance, get larger, so, if you expand an image and the next page has the same image with the same ID bigger, it'll like get bigger there for you. So have you messed with any of that stuff yet?
So we have we have a different animation and morphing API that's predates the free transition API by like quite some years.
Yeah,
where we basically we have both. We have the old and the new element, and we just visually lay them on top of each other, and then we can stuff like crossfading, or like the one thing slides out from the left and the other thing goes in from the right. Well, that's something that we can do. What we can not do as well as the View Transition API is this automatic morphing of like this shared element where like a thumbnail like grows to the. I'm
not sure how well it works either. I will say, like, I've seen a demo of it, but I've never actually got it to function correctly. So.
It's another thing that like because I already told you that like something that we like eyeing for like version 4 is like replacing a lot of stuff with like built-in capabilities. But I mean, the View Transition API has some limitations, like you cannot have multiple of them at once. Like exit animations are hard, stuff like that. So again, it's a thing that would save us some JavaScript, but like would cover like fewer edge cases than we have right now. So
tough to get rid of those edge cases. You work hard for those edge cases. Like edge cases build up over a decade, and they're pretty great by the end. Like that's,
I mean, it would be a breaking change, but
that's a tough call. I don't know. So who else is like Unpoly? Is it like a GitHub, open source project that people contribute to, or is it something just kind of on the Unpoly site and people just kind of download it and use it? Like where do you sort of see it, or what is it? I actually don't know if it's something people contribute to.
Yeah, so we have a pretty extensive documentation site on unpoly.com. It's also an open source project. Right now, the maintainers are like mostly myself and like to a lesser extent some of my colleagues. Like we have some like contributions, of course, but those tend to be like small bug fixes and documentation changes and so on. Like I also have like this someone Adam who helps me like triage issues on GitHub, which has become quite a task. Yeah.
Well, what sort of issues do people come across? I mean, is it like those edge cases kind of thing, or is it like, I mean, just sort of in your opinion, like when you look at the project, like big picture, like what sort of stuff is coming up for people?
I mean, on the one hand, people will always have edge cases like, I don't know, someone enters a URL with like with 3 slashes and something crashes.
So something ends their URL with 3 slashes. Okay.
Yeah, for instance, and that's something I didn't think about.
Well, I mean, is it legit? Is that a real way to end a URL?
So the browser will make a request and our code runs, so we probably need to deal with that eventually. But then again, people have actually ideas that grow into larger changes. For instance, the whole optimistic rendering thing came from an issue called allow custom navigation feedback, because we had a way to add classes to the target element that was loading for quite some time, but
that makes sense.
ran into some limitation with that, and then that actually grew into the idea, is there maybe a way to do something like optimistic rendering? And that grows into like a 4-month project in the library.
Yeah.
But overall, I think by now we have covered a lot of ground, so the issues tend to grow a little tamer over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that I have noticed about HTMX, and also some of the other libraries that are and frameworks that are doing similar stuff to Unpoly as well. But it's like the core stuff, there isn't a need to sort of change that much all the time. I mean, maybe you can, you're adding new features and stuff like that, but it doesn't seem like you have this kind of unless you decide to go deep on the browser stuff and do a big rewrite to incorporate more browser stuff, like the core stuff is pretty much the same for a lot of versions, right?
I mean, especially if you have some prior experience in the space, for instance with HTMX, it grew out of an earlier library called Intercooler, so Carson had some experience. It's HTMX 2, but actually it's probably 4 or something, because Intercooler was before that. And
right.
I mean, we're also on a major version 3, and we did some drastic course corrections with Unpoly 2 and then 3. But by the time you're on major 3 or 4, that's a time where I think it's realistic to go into a place where breaking changes become fewer. I think it's completely unrealistic to have this when you start out. If you have zero experience in a space and start to have any ambitious non-trivial API design, you are going to make mistakes. I mean,
not even mistakes, it's or just you find a better path,
Yeah. I mean, there's when you start the initial design, there's no time where you're going to have less experience about the space than at that point. So it's it would be sad if you don't learn anything and you are going to eventually break stuff. But we right now we've managed to stay on the 3.x line for quite a while, and we found, I think, a good way to deal with breaking changes. But we have this separate protocol called Unpoly migrate that you can load into your app, and that actually contains that adds support for old
cool.
APIs going back to Unpoly 1. So the way to upgrade it is you
That's an
like
interesting approach.
you bump the version, and you wrote the migrate script, and that just like prints warnings or errors for everything that you're using in the old style. And then you can like just update the call sites.
Is that something you came up with, or have you seen that in other upgrades? I've never seen that before. That's a cool idea.
I think jQuery has this jQuery migrate thing.
Okay.
For people who can't upgrade right now. I mean, at first we had this issue of like these old deprecations growing more and more and taking up file size. So the colleague had the idea to extract its own file.
Yeah.
And it's been working quite nice, especially if you have like some kind of end-to-end testing, and you can just like make sure that like any warning just like fails the test suite. So it's a pretty nice way to deal with breaking changes.
Feels very organized to just like, okay, I'm going to add a file temporarily, my migration file, and then that's going to cause problems or show me the problems. And then by the time I'm finished, I will remove this file. I won't need it anymore. Yeah. That's nice.
And it also like eases the pressure on the API designers, like, because like we know that we have this way to lessen the pain for the users, so we can like probably live with a breaking change sometimes.
Yeah. Well, that's one of my least favorite things in the world is upgrading to a new version of something and having just no clue what I'm in for. like I have an app. It's got 150 pages on it in different places. So what's going to break here? I have no idea. So that's a nice. I like that. I like that approach. Nice. So I mean, yeah, I think I think just overall, I think it's super cool that you put this up online and made it available to other people. I think you could have easily just kept it internal and worked on it and had it, help your business and stuff like that. So I think it's just super cool. We taking that step and putting it out there for the world and getting people to use it. It's an awesome approach.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I really suck at marketing. I don't do this kind of podcast very often because like always when I have the choice to do marketing or like write more code, I always choose more code. So basically the only marketing that this library had was Carson. Like he's like because he's such a nice guy, and he always promotes like all the Hypermedia libraries in the space. Every time he tweets, we get like a 50 additional stars from people who discovered us. So our marketing department is basically Carson.
That's awesome. Well, no, I mean, you're doing the work and building the product into something really nice. So it's like when people get a chance to see it, they like it. So I think that's awesome. So yeah. Well, I just, anything else you want to plug or mention before we go?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I think it's okay. Thanks for your interest. I know this isn't an Unpoly podcast; it's an HTMX podcast.
But it's tangential, and I think it's the thing is like what I really believe is that people should find the approach that matches with the way they think and the way they it's like everyone has this mental model of the web and of their projects, and the closer you can find a tool to your mental model, the faster you're going to build stuff. And so, I mean, you, for instance, have built the tool to match your mental model perfectly. So, that gives just huge benefits. But, for me, HTMX matches up really nicely. Unpoly also is in the same vein. I use Livewire. So, like, I use all these projects for different things. And I just think it's something that is, people should find what matches for them. Try stuff out. It's super easy to go. You can go to the Unpoly, website and like do a couple of the examples. The one gotcha that I will say, because I did it myself, is I don't think it said anywhere that you have to have something labeled as up main or use the main tag. But it seems like some of the stuff won't work unless you use that. So just keep that in mind when you're doing examples.
Yeah, I think the onboarding process could like profit from more love. So like documentation, I think it's been like the most painful part of the project. We have a lot of documentation, but it's like it all grew out of like an API reference, and that's not a great way to like get into it. And I know we should like do some better tutorial, like maybe a video. That's something that I have on my list, definitely.
Yeah. No, I mean, hopefully that's can be done in a fun way for you. I mean, it's if it's a chore, then it's hard to kind of justify. But if you find a fun way to show off Unpoly through a video or a blog post or whatever, I think that's something like that. Just find something that's fun for you and actually fun for you to build. That makes life a lot easier.
Yeah. I mean, something that I struggle with is like, because you always need to have the backend component. Like if you want to demo like a single page app, it always works like with just having like a static piece of HTML on the page or some JavaScript. Yeah. But when you want to demo like an MPA based approach, you always need to think like, how am I going to build the backend in a way that it works for all my readers who are going to have different backgrounds. Some will like be PHP people, like Node people, Ruby people. So that's something that that's been challenging.
Yeah, but like what you've done though is, at least on the examples that are there, is use HTML, I think, right? And that is pretty good. I found one of the problems definitely for that. I've had, so I'm working on right now and building this, Hype CP page, which is a bunch of, right now it's just HTMX, but the goal is to build up a bunch of examples. And it's the same thing where it's kind of annoying to have to show people, here's the file that's going to be loaded, right? Like what's the good way to sort of, because it's a lot of info. It's like an info dump to show a huge HTML page, And so it's like, it's nicer if you just have the code snippet, but it's like you need to still say like, okay, but it's going to load this file and put it there. And so like just finding a way to show that I have found is a little tricky.
Yeah. I mean, the static HTML works for like simple stuff like links, but like something that we didn't talk today a lot about is like complex forms, which is also something that like we have a lot of features for. And when you have like a form, you need to have like some backend endpoint that processes the form data. And then I need to have some kind of server-side code. And I need to have like a view template and maybe some small snippet of JavaScript. And that starts to become very hard to convey to users. I mean, I can quickly switch from one to the other, but that tends to confuse readers who want to get into this. So that's something that I'm thinking hard about right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the advantages I think you have is that because Unpoly does do a lot of the defaults for you, like you said, you've set a lot of those defaults. This is just my personal opinion, but I think you could record a series of pretty short videos to demonstrate kind of each, really just a simple version of each. And then of course, like, people who want to get into it can get into it and learn about all the different options and all this sort of stuff. But like, because you've already thought about what those defaults are, you don't need to get into anything. Just showing what Unpoly does, I think that's valuable just by itself, even if you don't go into all the details. Like they can look at the website. Clearly there's a ton of work and API thought and all this other stuff that goes into it, but just seeing the basics and getting that mental model in place, I think that would be really valuable for people.
Yeah, that's good feedback.
So, all right. Well, thank you very much for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me
to talk. So great. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.